Our paradigms, mental models, and mindsets can form an impenetrable barrier to change. They influence whether we're open to learning from events around us and what we put our attention to, such as what we reward, sanction, ignore, as well as the kinds of goals, strategies, and processes that we will endorse, and even the type of information that we will and won't attend to. And when our paradigms, mental models, and mindsets or what I like to call our inner voice, become our outer voice, it can even influence what information others put in front of you and how they communicate with you. And it's here in our outer voice where our inner voice becomes observable to others. That is, people are then informed of our assumptions, beliefs, and values by what we comment on, what we encourage or endorse. And oddly enough, people might take what we don't comment on as part of our inner voice, even if that's not what we want our inner voice to say. For example, when your board doesn't find the time to talk about health, safety, and well-being matters, that may be interpreted by others as the board isn't interested in the safety, health, and well-being of others over other pressing issues. But here's where things get really interesting. Our inner voice can actually insulate us from alternative ways of understanding things through what is called a reflexive loop. In this video, I'm going to explain this reflexive loop and how it can keep you from being open-minded and therefore open to seeing red flags in your organization. I'm also going to show you how you can break this loop. I'm Samantha McGolrick, and welcome to our little corner of the internet where I help purpose-driven board members drive systemic change and make a positive impact on the health, happiness, and resilience of society. We can come to very different understandings depending on what aspects of the situation we notice and how we interpret what is going on. And these are both influenced by our dominant paradigms, our mental models, and mindsets, or our inner voice. And while that's clearly important to understand in terms of the influence that our inner voice has on our decision making, it's also important to recognize that our decisions are not made in isolation, and there are cascading effects in your organization that you're not even aware of that can have immediate consequences or inform other decisions or events that happen days, months, or even years down the track when you're no longer there. Which means you have even more of an ethical responsibility to be aware of your inner voice and how it might restrict whether or not you're open to learning. The reflexive loop is a cognitive process that can actually reaffirm how well or how right our inner voice is, and it can prevent us from listening to alternative ways of understanding things, which is particularly dangerous if it prevents us from learning. Now, one of the tools that we can use to better problem solve and be aware of our inner voice is the Ladder of Inference. It graphically depicts the process we use to draw our opinions and judgments from data, showing that our individual evaluations are, or the way we see things, in reality, highly abstract and inferred. Let's walk through this. At the bottom of the Ladder of Inference is the data that we directly observe. These are the things that can be objectively observed. From that objective data, we become subjective. We let our inner voice and our cultural influences, like group dynamics, interpret and make sense of the situation. For example, I was speaking with a non-executive director who was explaining his initial reaction to an incident he had heard about in his organization of which he was a member of, where a truck at an airport had hit a plane on the tarmac. He said his initial reaction to the incident was a question of whether the driver of the truck was drunk. The directly observable data from the event is that a truck hit a plane. But what comes after that is the power of our inner voice. In a previous video, which I encourage you to take a look at, I talked about two controlling or dominant paradigms in our boardrooms around the way work is done. One of them was the paradigm of linear thinking. And this paradigm means that you likely believe that incidents happen through a sequence of events that line up in a linear fashion. Event A causes event B, which causes event C, and so on. Now, this line of thinking leads us down a path to hunt for what's broken or bad decisions. Your inner voice would likely say the same thing that that director was saying. Was he drunk? Or was he distracted and on his phone? Or was he fatigued? Now, these factors might be true, but the linear thinking paradigm supports a mental model that believes human error is a cause of incidents, not a symptom of something deeper happening in the system. So our investigations will stop at someone making a bad decision rather than trying to understand what are the patterns of behavior and how is the structure of the system influenced by people's decision making. This mental model of human error as the cause of incidents is supported by the belief that people in general are a problem to solve or control because the more control we have, the less room there is for human error. And all of those questions, was he drunk, was he fatigued, was he distracted, are focused on human error and someone making a bad decision. And on the ladder of inference, these questions are on those higher rungs of the ladder, where we're making judgments and applying our personal values to the observable data that we've been given. There is nothing inherently wrong with drawing inferences and conclusions from the events we observe. In fact, the ability to move quickly up the ladder is what enables us to make sense of the incredibly complex, infinitely detailed world in which we live. It is impossible for us to see and absorb everything in this world. We are constantly selecting out a narrow slice of life to focus on and understand. What we don't often realize, however, is that our inner voice and the cultural dynamics directly affect what new observable data we will let into our decision making. Meaning we will ignore or filter out information that does not align to our inner voice or the cultural dynamics of the group. We simply won't be aware of an alternative way to look at an event. Even more concerning is that all of this data that we see confirms our beliefs and assumptions, our inner voice. And this is called the reflexive loop. Reflexive meaning that it's something that turns back onto itself. And this happens subconsciously and involuntarily. This is reflected in the arrow on the left of the ladder, showing how our inner voice can influence what information we pay attention to and reaffirm our way of seeing things, which can then distort our future decision making and close our mind to learning from others. When we make leaps up the ladder of inference from data to values and assumptions, we're operating based on those assumptions as if they're reality. It can also be called the paradigm creating loop because it is the process through which over time we develop a shared set of cultural assumptions and values about how we view reality. In the book, The Machine That Changed the World, there is a striking example of how this paradigm creating process literally affects our ability to see. The book describes a not-so-new system now of manufacturing invented by Toyota called lean production that used less material, required smaller inventories, had a shorter design time, and produced fewer defects than the traditional mass production system. The authors tell the story of a General Motors plant manager's reaction after seeing a lean production plant in Japan. He reported that secret repair areas and secret inventories had to exist behind the plant because he hadn't seen enough of either for a real plant. In actuality, there was no rework area in that plant. They drove the cars right off the assembly line and onto the ships. The General Motors manager's paradigm of a real plant kept him from seeing that there might be an alternative way to produce cars. In our airport example, the shared assumptions of that governance committee, likely informed by the inner voice of those on the committee, became incidents are a result of human error. That is, people are not paying enough attention, not obeying the rules or following the procedure or investing enough effort, when in actual fact, human error is a consequence of incidents, not a cause. In other words, if people are doing the wrong thing, it really is a symptom of trouble deeper inside the system. And to that, I'd add companies that seek to add more automation and proceduralization to reduce variety, diversity, deviations, and instability end up reducing people's autonomy, creativity, and reactivity. And this makes your system or your organization increasingly brittle, where the work is not linear and simple. And that is most of the work in our organization. So what can you do to avoid the trap of the reflexive loop? Well, one of the ways is to use the ladder of inference and be aware of the power of our mental models, paradigms, and mindsets. Be aware of your inner voice. To help you use the ladder of inference, I've created a short guide that you can download here. The guide will act as a framework for you and your board to go through a step-by-step reasoning process that will help everyone remain objective. Or you could use it as your personal tool to check your line of thinking. The guide will be particularly useful when you're working or challenging others, or where you want to reach a shared conclusion without conflict. Because you're all clear about the role your paradigms, mental models, and mindsets can play in your decision making, because the ladder makes it easier to talk about at what point research shows that we start to add in judgments, values, and assumptions. The ladder also helps us be transparent with each other on why we are selecting certain data to inform our decision making and not others. As always, I hope this has helped you in your quest to know what to ask and when to act. Be brave and stay true to your commitment to lead from the heart, and I'm confident you will reap the rewards. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you click that subscribe button to help my content rise to the top so that others can enjoy it as well.